Good evening. This is Thomas Robert Simpson with the Afro Solo Theater Company. We are an arts organization whose goal is to develop, present, and promote African American and artists from the African diaspora in solo performances, as well as the literary arts. Today is a very special day for us. This is our first day on SF Live with Afro Solo TV. What we will be doing is interviewing artists as well as community people related to the arts about what's going on in our neighborhood. Our first guest is someone who is extraordinary. He's an artist, he's a director, he's a writer, he is a man with many talents. His name is W. Alan Taylor. We're here today to talk about his one-person show that he wrote that Afro Solo will be presenting in February and part of March. Let's welcome Mr. Taylor. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, and I'm so honored to be here on your inaugural.
Well, it's a real treat for me to have you here. And in some ways, us being here together sort of is a homecoming, in the sense that your piece, Walking, Talking Bill Hawkins, In Search of My Father, had some of its origins in Afro Solo back in '99. Do you remember that?
Oh, do I remember? It's very fitting to be back in association with you, Thomas. I've been working on this show almost 10 years now. And at the beginning of my process, I was doing a workshop over at the Z Space when it was over on Mission, and you occupied a space within that same complex. And Afro Solo sponsored a workshop that was being presented by my to-be director, Ellen Sebastian Chang.
Yes.
And you introduced me to her. I took the workshop, and between Afro Solo and Z Space, that was how I developed my piece. So I'm really very indebted to the history of this piece.
Welcome home.
Yes.
Before we begin to talk a lot about the piece, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got started in theater, where, and maybe why?
Oh, boy. I moved to New York in the 70s, and I was working in the nonprofit world, but sort of in the corporate milieu. I was working for United Way as a corporate fundraiser. And I was walking down the street in Brooklyn and ran into a friend of mine from Ohio. I grew up in Cleveland, and I was going to Ohio State for 5 years, and I befriended this guy who had moved to New York and become an actor.
Wow.
And he was doing Shakespeare's Coriolanus down at the Public Theater. And I had no idea what the Public Theater was. I didn't know I knew who Shakespeare was, but I didn't know anything about Coriolanus. And he said, "Yeah, man, great to see you, and I'm doing this show. You ought to come down and check it out. There's some great actors in it." And I didn't go, and I could kick myself to this day. Morgan Freeman was in the show.
Wow.
Denzel was in the show.
Wow.
Sam Jackson was in the show.
Wow.
I didn't go, but we stayed in touch. And he took me to another show that was called The Mighty Gents, a black play. And Denzel was in that show along with Sam, and I was blown away by the play and by the performances. And then I ended up taking this Black Theater workshop that he also suggested for me. And I was bitten immediately.
Okay.
I knew it was for me.
Well, with your history of being in the theater, can you think of a role that is memorable for you, something that you really liked?
That's a tough one. I guess I'd have to go to, I've done a couple of August Wilson plays that I'm very, very fond of. Piano Lesson and the character of Avery, for those theater artists out there who know the play. The character of Avery is a wonderful character. And the play takes place in the 30s. And without giving a long thing about the play itself, it was just one of those roles that it was great on several levels. It was great because of the challenges of the role itself. He was this preacher in the 1930s in Pittsburgh, but he was from the South, and he was the suitor of one of the main characters in the play, and it was just a fun role. Okay. But I was working with Lloyd Richards and August Wilson directly. Wow. So that was my first time working with them, and I ended up working with them twice after that. And it was just, they both have passed away, and of course are theater gods.
Sure.
And it was so great
just for the viewers who may not be familiar with August Wilson, was a very famous playwright who wrote a number of plays sort of chronologing the black experience from the 1900s to the to the 2000s. And it was at that time that he became sick and passed away not too long ago. And Lloyd Richards was a phenomenal director.
Well, I actually had more contact with Lloyd than I did with August because Lloyd was directing the play.
Sure.
And I started out as an understudy at ACT, and then ended up taking over the role. The play was actually in a post-Broadway tour, and San Francisco was one of the cities, and I was an understudy here, and then ended up taking over the role as it continued the tour because the guy I was understudying ended up going back to LA for a film.
Wow.
And they saw me go. I had gone on for him a couple of times, and they said, "Hey, well, AT can do it." I'm known as AT
Yes.
in the theater world. So I ended up doing that tour, and then they hired me subsequently for a couple of more shows, and it was great because Lloyd was such a phenomenal director. I mean, he was like a little Buddha in a lot of ways. He didn't say very much, but when he said something, it was absolutely profound.
He was legendary.
Legendary, absolutely. Well, he was the original director of Raisin in the Sun,
Yes.
1959, with Sidney Poitier, and he was the first black director of a Broadway show, drama. So it was really a phenomenal experience for me to work with someone of that caliber.
Great. Now, in taking your experience in terms of your classes, workshops, going to ACT, working on and off Broadway, something led you to Walkin' Talkin' Bill Hawkins. Now, in a nutshell, can you tell us a little bit about what Walkin' Talkin' Bill Hawkins in Search of My Father is about? And then we'll get into more of the meat of it.
Okay. Well, the play is about my search for the father I never knew. Walkin' Talkin' Bill Hawkins was my father's radio name. He was the first black disc jockey in Cleveland, Ohio, in the late 40s, from 1948 to 1958. And I didn't know anything about him growing up. My mother and he had an illicit affair. My father was married, and my mother was recently divorced. This was in the early 50s. My mother had been married to a Baptist minister for 13 years. So when she got pregnant, it was a potential scandal, you can imagine. So they kept it from me my entire childhood. I didn't find out about him until I was an adult. And when I did find out, well, I have to preface that event by saying that when I was 18 years old, my mother and father conspired for me to meet him in the guise of a job interview.
With your knowing it or not knowing it?
With me not knowing.
What was going on?
He wanted to see what kind of man I turned out to be.
Wow.
My mother said, "Alan, I have this job interview. I want you to go downtown and check out. This is a way for you to make some extra money before you go off to college." I was excited, right? So I go down and have this interview, and this man sits with me for about an hour and never mentions that he's my father. And I knew there was something very familiar about him, but I wasn't thinking, in a million years that that's who he was. But it was a strange interview because he didn't say anything about the job. I kept having to bring him back to the subject, right? So I left the meeting, he was asking me if I was, did I have a girlfriend, did I play basketball, all these personal questions. So anyway, I left there feeling very strange about the meeting, and that's why it's really remained an indelible memory for me. But fast forward, I go off to college, and I became a radio announcer on my own. Okay, I had a very popular radio show, decided that's what I wanted to do with my life. My mother then tells me, after graduation, who my father is, tells me that he passed away just a few months before I graduated, and that he was the man I met when I was 18 years old.
Wow.
So I was on an emotional roller coaster,
Sure.
and I've been searching ever since.
Okay.
So this play is basically, what I did was I went out and I interviewed a number of people who knew my father or who had some kind of connection with my father, and I created composite characters that I play in the show. I juxtaposed those portrayals with stories of surrogate fathers, men that meant something to me along my way. So it's more than just a literal search for my father.
Sure.
It's also about the metaphorical search for what it means to be a father and for what it means to be a man. And so I think it's larger than just my story, and I think that's one of the things that makes it universal, that people come to my show and they really feel a connection to their stories.
Right.
And I'm always having people come up to me after the show talking
For
about their
me,
stories.
that's one of the real interesting things about art, is that through one person's story, we make connections with each other. It's sort of like we're all drawing from that same pool of life that we come from.
Exactly.
I think one writer called it a collective conscience that we all kind of share.
That's right.
So when we go into or produce something that's artistic, somehow or other, I feel we're able to tap into that. So your story, in some ways, can remind me so much of my story,
Yes.
and vice versa. Have you experienced that in going to shows?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what theater is all about, you know.